Okay, so the final article that we're going to read for this section is one written by Ralph Donelson. Ralph Donelson is a legal scholar who writes a very philosophical article for the Oklahoma Law Review titled The Inherent Problem with Mass Incarceration. And so to begin his article, Donelson offers us a sort of thought experiment in which he asks us to imagine a society in which the majority of the population is incarcerated. And he makes a few special points that make it so that this hypothetical country is dissimilar from the U.S. One of these is that he says that in the hypothetical thought experiment, we can imagine that all the laws are enforced equally, so it's not related to race or gender or class distinctions. He also asks us to imagine that in this society, prisons are fairly safe, they're clean, they're not sort of havens for violence and abuse. And in this way, his approach is very different than that taken by Altman and Co., because he wants us to start from a much more abstracted perspective and then move to addressing a sort of real-world issue. But Donelson raises this thought experiment in order to ask what is sort of the guiding question of his article. So he asks, is there anything wrong with a legal system like this? That is, a system that happens to incarcerate a large portion of its citizenry. And his answer is yes. And the reasons for this answer are very, very different than those offered by Altman and Co., because Donelson wants to argue that regardless of the conditions of incarceration, and regardless of whether the laws in a society are unfair or the laws in a society are unfairly enforced, that there is something that is just inherently wrong with mass incarceration just by itself as an institution. And so I'm going to read a quote from him where he says, even if the criminal laws are just and legitimate, even if the criminal justice system is equitable, even if the jails are well kept and the economy continues to function, the problem with such a society is its lack of freedom. And so that's going to be the sort of crux of his argument here. So his specific argument is related to a theory of society offered by Thomas Hobbes, who was a philosopher who lived primarily in the 17th century and is a very influential and particularly well-known political philosopher. But Donelson is going to sort of use a Hobbesian framework to argue that the reason that mass incarceration is inherently wrong is because it involves a society which lacks freedom, and that people would not, given the opportunity, consent to live in such a society that just imprisons a great number of its population. And we're going to get more into the details of his argument a little bit later. But before we get into his Hobbesian sort of main argument, he replies to what he calls the contingent critique and describes why he thinks these sort of miss the mark, or that these are sort of functioning in a different way than the argument that he's putting forward. And so I think the Altman and Co. paper would fit nicely into what he calls the contingent critique. So essentially he argues that people who often criticize mass incarceration in America focus on things that are not necessary to mass incarceration itself, meaning that in principle these features could be removed while still allowing for mass incarceration as a system to exist. So he says they tend to focus on a cluster of problems that are serious but ultimately not essential to mass incarceration. First are concerns about certain problematic background conditions that occur before anyone has ever been incarcerated. So the social conditions that might lead to incarceration is often a focus of critics. Second are concerns about what happens to people while they're incarcerated. So people often criticize the conditions that exist within prison as a means of saying that mass incarceration is wrong. They say, well, the prisons are really horrible places to be, and here's some data to back that up. And third, people often critique incarceration on the basis of what happens to people after they're incarcerated. So people talk about how you might become disenfranchised, you might have difficulty finding jobs, or lose your ability to vote. And so that's another reason that people argue against the system of mass incarceration. He says, okay, these are all very important issues, and they're very important sites of argumentation, but he says his claim in this paper is on something that is actually essential to mass incarceration itself and is independent of any contingent factors. So what is Donelson's argument then? He says, as I said previously, he makes his argument using a sort of Hobbesian framework, or one that is adopted from the philosopher Thomas Hobbes. And one of the ideas that Hobbes is most famous for is the idea of sort of the social contract, the idea that people agree to live in society with one another only because it is better than what he calls the state of nature, in which lives, he says, in the state of nature, he describes them as nasty, brutish, and short. So for Hobbes, we only agree to live in society with one another, or we only sort of like hypothetically would agree to live in society with one another. And relatedly, that the government of a society, so this is very important, the government of a society can only be considered justified or legitimate because that society offers important benefits that we need for survival. Thus, for Hobbes, the legitimacy of a government is based on the idea of a sort of hypothetical contract in which the government has certain goods that it needs to provide, or there are certain things that it needs to secure on its own end as if it were a sort of contractual agreement. Meanwhile, the people who live in that society need to also uphold their end of the contract as well. So, and Donelson takes the Hobbes framework to mean that part of the social contract that justifies us being subject to governmental authority, us being subject to certain laws or certain restrictions, involves the agreement that this society will offer freedom. So here's a quote from Donelson. He says, quote, "For Hobbes, the people in the state of nature form a covenant with one another to institute a state in order to have safety and a free society where people can engage in industry, discovery, and creation. A polity characterized by mass incarceration is not a free society. If the state arises because and is justified to the extent that it fulfills our desire to live in a free society, a state with mass incarceration is problematic." So he says one of the roles of the government is then to secure our ability to pursue the kinds of projects we believe are involved in freedom and in having a free society, and that to have incarceration on the mass scale undermines this as a social goal because it prevents the society from making a legitimate claim to being a free society. And without this, that society or the government that rules over that society loses its claim to legitimacy. So that is his argument against mass incarceration. It's important to note that he says that one person being incarcerated would not undermine this sort of freedom that he's talking about. It's not necessarily securing perfect freedom for each individual, because there is some extent to which people have to uphold their end of, the social contract. But he also, I think, makes a really interesting style of argumentation to argue against the real-world phenomenon of mass incarceration by taking a much more theoretical approach than the previous article that we read. So I want you to kind of note the differences in form, sort of between his style of argumentation and that of the other article. But I think they're very different. I think they're very interesting, and I hope you all will spend some time with them.